and gentlemen, we hope that you enjoyed your lunch. We will now commence with the luncheon address. Can I invite to the stage Mr. Edward Robinson, Deputy Managing Director of Economic Policy and Chief Economist at the Monetary Authority of Singapore, to provide the introductory remarks, please.
Emeritus Senior Minister Goh Chok Tong, Managing Director MAS Minister Ravi Menon, President NUS Professor Tan Eng Chai, ladies and gentlemen. So we are now at today's special luncheon session, and we are very privileged to have Nobel laureate Mike Spence to address us. Mike was appointed chair of the Commission on Growth and Development when it was formed in April 2006, and this was under the auspices of the World Bank. The mandate of the Growth Commission was to gather the best understanding there was then about the policies and strategies that underlie rapid economic growth and poverty reduction. Mike himself chaired 6 commission meetings and oversaw 12 workshops where more than 300 academics contributed independent papers. To him lay the formidable task of assimilating and digesting this cumulative wealth of experience and insight. The result was the Growth Commission report published in 2008. The report examined the 13 economies that sustained real GDP growth of at least 7% per annum for 25 years or longer over the period 1950 to 2005. Although they were operating in very different political economy configurations, 5 characteristics or policy ingredients were identified. Mike will go through some of these in a moment, but they include fully exploiting the world economy, to committed and credible governments that were able to make long-term growth strategies and secure the social consensus to implement them. At this lunch, we are also honored to have with us a special guest, ESM Goh Chok Tong, who served as one of the illustrious commission members. ESM hosted a commission meeting in Singapore in 2006, and where he shared his experiences from the key role he played in Singapore's development journey as Prime Minister, among the other senior roles that he held in government. ESM well knew the enormity of the task confronting policymakers. In his own words, quote, "The subject of growth and development is complex and fascinating. There is no one-size-all-fits formula, but a country must have the necessary conditions of effective political leadership, sound institutions, and social consensus on reform, and the sharing of fruits." ESM also pointed out that besides having the right ingredients and the right recipe for growth, you must also have a master chef. Now, 15 years from the publication of the Growth Report, the development agenda is still works in progress. Many countries have advanced, yet too many others have slipped. Today's session will give us a good opportunity to cast a retrospective look back on the report and to look forward. And indeed, it's timely because major structural shifts are imposing new constraints on growth. The case for free trade has yet again come under serious renewed strain. Macroeconomic stability has become more challenging amid the frequent supply-side shocks. Mastering national saving and investment has become more involved as views about what makes for the collective long-term welfare of a nation have become polarized in many economies. To add to these, the adverse effects of climate change are more evident now than they were 15 years ago when the report sounded its initial warnings. At the same time, new opportunities have emerged. Digitization, as well as technological advances in Industry 4.0, artificial intelligence, and climate change mitigants may offer solutions to some of our most pressing constraints on growth today. These opportunities obligate policymakers to establish the conditions for new technologies to be harnessed thoughtfully and ethically to contribute to a nation's shared view of its future prosperity. What is also clear is that there is further scope for economic models to incorporate the complex interactions between growth, the major structural change, and government strategies. This includes explicitly recognizing how the government's role in the growth story has broadened. The empirical literature has shown that governments play a crucial role in pushing economies towards a favorable, balanced growth path. They encourage national saving, crowd in private investment, and are proximate enablers of private sector innovation. Beyond that, governments must build in mechanisms to improve social mobility within their populations. Otherwise, politics and policies may then become inimical to sustain growth. We still need to unpack these hidden factors and elements from total factor productivity. Mike has been an astute observer of the growth agenda. I've had the personal privilege of working with him, including on a case study of Singapore's growth experience at the time of the Growth Commission. In the years that I've known him, I've appreciated his insightfulness, candor, and wisdom. And he has just an inspiring posture about him. These qualities have made Mike a keen and engaging commentator of our fast-evolving world. Mike has emphasized the distributional impacts that globalization and technological advancement can have on subgroups within economies. And in response, he has called for an inclusive, centrist, and pragmatic growth agenda with a cooperative problem-solving approach. Mike has deeply appreciated the role that an effective government with a strong future-oriented orientation can play in underpinning sustained growth. And recently, he warned us that decoupling is a distinctively suboptimal and perilous cause amid the mutual distrust equation that has emerged. Mike's intervention today, I'm sure, will provide us with valuable food for thought about the path of sustained growth in our poly-crisis world, similar to what he did through the growth report some 15 years ago. Now, after Mike's speech, Professor Steve Davis of Chicago Booth, a School of Business senior fellow at Hoover, an advisor at the Economic Policy Group, MES, will facilitate these discussions. Steve himself has contributed so much to AMPF, ABFER more generally as well. He has spent a lot of time with the MES, economists at MES, and shared with us his many insights into the applied research topics that he has worked on and has particular relevance to central banking as well. My colleagues and I at EPG have been enriched working and learning from him over many years. Thank you. For now, can I invite Professor Mike Spence to deliver his lecture? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Edward. Senior Minister Emeritus Goh Chok Tong, one of my more important teachers, President Tong An Chi, Dean Bernard Leung, Dean Danny Kwa, nice to see you, Managing Director Ravi Menon, Deputy MD Edward Robinson, and my friend Taekok Peng. I'm delighted to be with you. So colleagues and friends, it's very hard for me to overstate how happy I am to be back in Singapore. I've learned so much here, now have good friends, and I think Singapore is a model of effective governance and successful growth strategy. And I'm honored to have a few minutes with you to talk a bit about really three things. One is what we thought we were doing in the Growth Commission. It's 15 years old. And what we got right and what we didn't see. Maybe we got some things wrong too. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the short to medium term headwinds to growth. They're not dissimilar to some of those items that were talked about in the context of the neutral interest rate. But after listening this morning, I realized how little I know about monetary economics, so I'm going to stay away from the question of what's the effect on interest rates. Maybe a side comment from the investment point of view. And finally, I would like to talk about some really powerful technological opportunities to restart growth as we get down the into the second part of this decade, I guess is what I would say. This is the growth report. It's not very long. I think on balance it's held up reasonably well. These are the members of the commission. There were two economists. One of them is very influential, Bob Solow. He's the one who gave us the proposition that growth strategies are specific to the environment. There isn't one, silver bullet, one size fits all. But he said the ingredients are very similar. Told us to focus on the ingredients, and the recipes are the ones that are different. Most of these folks are leaders, experienced people who fought, important battles and won some and lost a few others. And they dominated the discussion. And the purpose of this commission was essentially to take the rather extraordinary experience since the Washington Consensus 15 years before. The extraordinary growth in China, which was now fully visible and operating in high gear, the restart of growth in 1991 in India after the foreign exchange current balance of payments crisis, and so on. And our goal was to marry that with some really interesting research. That's why we had all those sessions with academics. They were reporting their research and their insights on a wide range of subjects, macro policy, distributional issues, and so on. And then we tried to synthesize it, and the proposition was that this was supposed to be a helpful input to the next generation of leaders who had to whom the baton would be passed. In the course of doing that, right at the start, Goh Chok Tong and his colleagues, he was at the time not only senior minister, but I think the chairman of the Monetary Authority, and they produced the first working paper that the commission produced. And it redirected us. I mean, I think I probably thought this was mainly about economics, and sort of technical things. And after I'd finished listening to these very experienced leaders, and this, is the most prominent example of that, because it redirected our attention right at the start. It's really about political economy as well. It's about leadership. It's about building consensus. It's about people having the willingness to do very hard things, accept policies that involve trade-offs between the present and the future, to accept very high investment rates supported by savings, and so on. And this paper just had a monumental effect on the directionality of the work that we did at the time. I mean, I think the only sad thing about this is we published this report precisely 3 months before, the great financial crisis caused the world to fall apart. So it, maybe got drowned out a little bit. Although, to be honest with you, I think it's held up pretty well. Now, these are these 13 countries. There's a funny anecdotal story associated with this. These used to be 12. And the one that was missing was Brazil. And Edmar Basha went back, is one of the triumvirate that got inflation under control in Brazil in the 1990s. Very talented man. And anyway, he went back and discovered that if you went all the way back to 1950, the World Bank data went back to 1960. Brazil actually belonged in this club. Then about 2 years ago, I got an email from Edmar, and he said, actually, we've redone the calculations, and we were wrong. So this now, you need to X out Brazil, and this is 12. Now, why do we do this? If you're doing, statistical analysis, you don't pick out the top end. I mean, this is about as biased a sample as you could get. But we were looking for best practices, and to be perfectly frank, we could have put up a list of underperformers, but that didn't seem politically the kind of optimal strategy if you want to have an impact. If you set the bar a little lower, like at 6%, you'd get a different outcome with a lot more players in the game, and so on. So this wasn't meant to be anything other than indicative. And by the way, you know, if we were doing this now, we would probably pay more attention to the middle income transition. And this list contains countries and economies that have gone through the middle income transition or trap at relatively high speed, and a whole bunch of others that didn't. So this initial success, I think you all know, in the long multi-decade journey in terms of growth, if you start at a very low level, then you're going to spend most of the time getting to the middle income level, just through the mechanics of doubling, even at high speed growth. And so since we did this work, I would say the big change in the world, or at least the developing world, is the vast majority of people are now in the middle income category. Not all, not in the low income countries, but it's a very different world than the one we were looking at the time. And the poverty reduction that has gone along with that incredible growth story is well known. These are the ingredients that Edward just talked about. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with them. Some of them are absolutely uncontroversial, like macroeconomic stability and the competence that goes with it. Everybody knows that if you make mistakes in that area, you have crises and setbacks that materially slow growth, because it takes half a decade typically to recover from those things. But this does emphasize some important things. The rough rule of thumb that we used based on experience was if your investment rates are below something like 25 to 30% of GDP, you probably can't sustain over extended periods of time 6-7% growth. When I look at developing countries even now, this literally the first thing I look at, after the quality of governance or some estimate of that, is the investment rate. So, for example, if you go to the data and look up the investment rate in Brazil, you'll discover it's 16% of GDP. There's just no chance that that's going to sustain the kinds of growth that Brazil has the potential to produce. I won't belabor these things, but they're interesting. And now, some reflections on this. This is sort of in the category of, what did we focus on? What was issues at the time? What did we see? What did we not see? We focused on the low to middle income transition. As I've just said, I think we would shift a little bit and spend a little more time on the middle to high income transitions. We certainly knew there was a process of moving the center of gravity of the global economy toward Asia, meaning eastward. And I just put Danny Quah's graph up here because he's done the most quantitative work illustrating this point. Those red dots, they're a little hard to see, I know, are basically his predictions back when he first did this. Danny, in 2008? Or roughly, yeah. At that time, the center of gravity was somewhere, just south of Turkey. And now it's, sort of, well, if you dropped it south, it's in the in the ocean between India and Malaysia. Climate change was very interesting. The policy people knew there was a significant problem coming, but the awareness, especially in the developing world, probably also in the developed world, of the magnitude of this challenge and its importance was way low. So that is a huge change from where we are now. The global economy was a pretty benign place from the point of view of development. It had the architecture of the post-World War II structures, relatively and increasingly open, relatively little instability in the big markets, like the developed countries, and so on. So it was a pretty benign environment. It's very different now. We would have to pay a lot more attention to how do you get to the global economy? Are there blockages with respect to the technology and so on? Now, what did we not see? Well, we certainly didn't see the fragmentation of the global economy. I'm going to talk later, there's several technological sort of revolutions underway, one in the biomedical and life sciences area, another digital one that everybody knows about. And there's a big technology component of the energy transition. We didn't really see all that coming. I mean, we had digital technology, but we didn't see economies built on digital platforms in the way that we're seeing now. And finally, we, I think, assumed that the world would be like the one we were living in for the last 3 decades, you know, with huge amounts of productive capacity being introduced into the global, in the tradable side of the global economy, and equally huge increments in terms of essentially what I would call a connected labor supply. And we didn't see something I've come to believe is very strongly, which is the fading of that very powerful deflationary force. This is, I'm going to skip over some of this fairly quickly. Distributional things were important to us. I think at one point we asked ourselves, meaning everybody on the commission, if you had to say one thing, what would it be? And with, I think, unanimity, is this right, Go Chok Tong? What we said was, if you screw up the distributional aspects of this, you'll fail, right? And so I take that away because I think, you know, in performance terms, in multiple dimensions, we have not solved the difficult problem of making these growth patterns sufficiently inclusive in order to sustain the policy, you know, agenda that gives rise to growth and expanded prosperity and development. By the way, this graph is extraordinarily important work by Thomas Piketty and his colleagues. We just know a whole lot more about distributional outcomes, income, wealth, pre and ex ante, ex post, you know, et cetera, than we knew at the time. This is a revolution. I won't spend much time on this except to say this is the existential challenge of our lifetime. I imagine everybody in the room knows this, but we have not peaked. We're at 36,000 billion tons of CO2 emissions, gross production-based. That's approximately 2.5 to 3 times anything that's vaguely resembling the safe level. The carbon intensity of the global economy declined in the past decade at 2% a year, which roughly matched, fell a little bit short of the growth, so we flattened out. We may be about to peak, but peaking's not enough, right? If you're going to hit the International Energy Agency milestones, you know, over the next 2 to 3 decades, we're going to have, you know, carbon intensity reductions at the rate of 5, 6, and 7% a year, and we're not close to that. So I think the scientific community is moving in the direction of saying we're not going to hit the 1.5 degree target at all, and that has dramatic consequences, including in the developing world. These are the top emitters. It's a pretty exclusive club. That's 71% of global emissions in just a rather small number of countries. They're, of course, very different in per capita emissions, so that's part of the normative part of that discussion. But that's kind of where we are. Now let me talk about the headwinds. So there's lots of headwinds to growth, okay? The pandemic screwed things up, and some of them were transitory. Probably policymakers and central banks overestimated what fraction of them were transitory and which ones were secular and weren't going to kind of go away. But there's lots of transitory ones that really did screw things up. This is a picture of it was discussed earlier today. This is a picture of the cost per container of ocean shipping. Went from 2,000 to 10,000. Now it's back down pretty much where it was. After a year of okay performance in China, China went into zero COVID mode with massive impact on both the domestic and the global economy. They're out of that now, and they're, you know, while there's lots of subtlety in talking about immediate growth prospects in China, basically the bounce back's pretty impressive. The pandemic closures have gone, you know, semiconductor shortages are normalizing or even reversing because of a pullback in the tech sector and so on. But there's a bunch of secular forces. Now, I have a personal guess as to what the sort of impact of that will be on the cost of capital going forward. But since I don't know anything compared to the people who talked this morning, I'm not going to say what I think. But I do think these are, taken together, are pretty powerful headwinds to growth for at least until something else comes in and provides us with. I've already mentioned one, this fading of the powerful deflationary and growth-oriented forces associated with supercharged developing country growth. For those of you who are familiar with development economics, there's an important idea that comes from Sir W. Arthur Lewis called the Lewis turning point, very prominently discussed in China. By analogy, I've called this the Lewis turning point in the global economy. Now, you could say there's unused productive, and potentially productive labor in lots of places. Still in India, lots in Africa. And if we get really good at this and unlock that, maybe we'll have an extension. I don't want to rule that out. But right now, it looks like those forces are not as powerful as they were before. We have aging. We talked about that today. That about a third of the world's population lives in countries and economies that are aging. But those countries account for over 75% of global GDP. So the other folks eventually could turn this around, but right now, economically, they're not big enough to change the sort of negative pattern. And you know the effect of aging. You have labor forces that are flattening out or declining, so you lose that source of growth. You have fiscal distress, depending on the way Social Security systems were constructed. But you also, when the retirement occurs with decent balance sheets underpinning, basically you get a reduction in productive capacity, but no comparable reduction in consumption, right? I know there was a lot of talk about savings, but you basically get an automatic, mismatch. It doesn't necessarily show up at the aggregate level. We have high and rising public debt ratios. That's partly because of, I'm going to stray into territory which I shouldn't, because of low interest rates and monetary policy over the last decade. But there was a big jump in sovereign debt in the pandemic, and it's a bit of a disaster in the low-income countries because it's just left them really vulnerable in terms of kind of fiscal capacity to do anything, whether it's absorb shocks or invest in the future. And then we have this pattern of diversification that's driven by increasing shocks like pandemics, wars, and climate, and then the geopolitical tension. So, we used to talk about this before. I remember the tsunami in Japan, brought the automobile industry globally to a halt because there was one part that was made relatively near Fukushima, and everybody said, well, this is just too tightly wound, we're going to unwind these a bit. Didn't happen. But it is happening now, and it's driven both by corporate behavior, you can see it, if you sit in boardrooms, but it's being driven by policy as well. And it's expensive, right? There's nothing good about this. It's directly overriding a system that we used to have that was built almost entirely on efficiency and comparative advantage considerations. And the farther we walk away from that, the more difficult it will be to reverse. In a sense, it's a factor in lowering productivity. And then we just have, I think, still poorly understood negative trends in productivity growth. We've got the Solo paradox and lots of study. The thing that got my attention recently, working with two very talented young economists from South Africa, looking at American data, ironically, is the scope and magnitude of the productivity drop in the American economy in the last decade. It's just stunning. And it's everywhere. So you take the highest productivity things, like in tech sectors and software, they dropped. They're still high, but they dropped. Take the low productivity sectors, productivity growth was low, it dropped, right? And it's almost like we got the wrong denominator in the calculation. I think there's some work to do on that front. I think we need to understand this. and so on. The bottom line is, I think when you add these things up, it's very difficult to convince yourself that there's any immediate prospect for the observable pattern of kind of lower growth. So then my last part of my remarks, just to kind of, I hope, get your interest, is to talk a little bit about, one thing on the American economy that I'll tell you. If we're going to understand this productivity problem, we're going to have to break the economy down into sectors. This happens to be a breakdown that associated with those two co-authors that has to do with the tradable and non-tradable part. And this is the last 2 decades. You can sort of see the flattening out, even though these things are not in logarithms. But that blue line is the tradable sector. In the American economy, the tradable sector is about 1/3 in value-added terms and about just over 20% in employment. And the non-tradable side is huge. It's 80% of employment, thank you, and so on. Basically, what the short version of this slide is productivity growth in the tradable sector, which used to be about half manufacturing and half tradable services, like consulting, finance, and so on. It's now more like 1/3 manufacturing and 2/3 tradable services, which is consistent with the shift, at least in terms of employment, to an economy that looks more like a service economy. Productivity growth in the tradable sector is almost 3% a year. In the non-tradable sector, it's barely over 0.5% a year. And that's where the employment is, right? The 5 big employment sectors in the American economy are government, healthcare, retail, traditional retail, hospitality, construction. That's about it. There may be one other that I've forgotten. It's 45% of employment in the American economy. And they have low productivity, low wages, and low productivity growth. I'm jumping ahead, but the current version of our artificial intelligence is going to operate on the knowledge economy, the white-collar part. That's pretty clear. At least the direct effect is going to operate there. So it's not going to operate on the non-work-from-home crowd, for the most part. I mean, that's an oversimplification. But there's a worrying aspect of the distributional aspects of this. So let me talk about these things. So when I try to make myself optimistic in the face of what I just told you, the way I went about it is I said, so what are the opportunities to really change this pattern? And what I got focused on is a set of incredibly powerful tools. So the transformations I'm talking about are basically the ones I mentioned before. It's energy, transition, or the technological part of that, the digital transformation, and the revolution in biomedical science, broadly defined. Includes agriculture, some materials, lots of things. So there's what I'm going to say now, and then I'll just flip through these slides, is we have these incredibly powerful tools, technologies coming out of science and engineering they don't just exist, but their cost is going down dramatically, and their accessibility is going up, right? So this is solar costs. They've gone down by a factor of 5 to 10 in the last decade, and with a little work from Ajay Banga, to reduce the capital costs. It's capital-intensive technology. It could be a fairly important part of the energy story in developing countries. It won't now because of the idiosyncratic characteristics of the capital costs. So how many of you have seen this? It's called AlphaFold. I don't know. No. That's interesting. So this is a quite revolutionary development. So DeepMind, which is owned by Alphabet in London, has done several things. The ones you probably know about are the game of Go. And that came in 2 parts, AlphaGo and AlphaZero, which is a much more powerful training algorithm for playing the game of Go. And I won't go into that. This was their kind of next project. Took 2 years, and the goal was to take the amino acid sequence that defines a protein and predict its 3-dimensional structure. This takes a well-trained PhD somewhere between months and years to do in a lab, and it's a very frustrating process. So they thought that an AI system that was able to make this prediction would actually help in biologic. Why is the three-dimensional structure important? Answer, because it determines what a protein binds to. Steve, I'm going to overrun slightly. So they worked on this for 2 years, and they basically succeeded. These predictions are not perfect. You know that AI systems are prediction machines, I assume. These predictions aren't perfect, but they're pretty good, you know, like 90, 95%, with a few outliers. So a guy in London, or England, who was trying to create enzymes to, you know, break down non-biodegradable plastic said, can I try it? And he phoned them up, and they said, yeah. So he sent them 3 proteins, meaning sequences, on Friday, and they sent back the answer on Monday. And he knew, this chap, the scientist, knew one of them, and they got that right. And the other 2, they've subsequently confirmed they got right. And then what they did is they took the 200 million known proteins in the world, predicted their structures, and made it an open source database. Everybody in the world doing research on this has access to this. I mean, it's just, now, are we going to measure this in the GDP numbers? No. But is it a revolutionary development in the efficiency and productivity in the biomedical sciences area? Yes. I'm sorry to take too long about it, but this story gets written over and over again. This is image recognition engineered by a friend of mine who's one of the leading AI people at Stanford, you know, Daryl's colleague, and Steve's and mine. And basically, this is a picture of when and how image recognition passed human capabilities. So in 2010, it was not very good. Before that, it was hopeless. Somewhere in this process, they switched to the neural network version of doing this, and then it went through the roof. This is crucial, right? It's not the whole story, but, you know, robots that can't see, image recognition to help doctors identify cancer in, you know, in radiology and so on. It has hundreds and hundreds of applications. This is the cost of DNA sequencing. It followed Moore's law until about 2008, and then dropped like a stone. So a full DNA sequence now costs something like $500 going to $250, starting at 10 million. This is gene editing. This is my favorite. These are the 2 women who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. In 2018, they were studying bacteria. Bacteria are attacked by viruses. The bacteria, as an evolutionary matter, learned how to cut the virus up and store the DNA. And that's how they figured out how to do gene editing. This is like all these technologies, they're powerful and a little bit scary, and they all have ethical issues associated with them that some combination of the community, the experts, the participants, and maybe some external regulators have to deal with. This is a very prominent example. This is the technology you can use to clone things like people. And finally, there's a kind of global, this strikes me as kind of really quite optimistic. So when we were doing the Growth Commission work, you could probably count on the fingers of one hand the major centers of sort of technology development, you know, in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship. Not the scientific research, but we lived in one of them. It's just not true anymore. It's happening everywhere. Right? China's the 2nd largest producer of unicorns. India's getting pretty close pretty fast. There's lots of them here. You know, in Singapore, you know, there's a few in Hong Kong. There's a ton of them in the ASEAN countries, you know, and the footprint's getting bigger and bigger. And Latin America is not missing in action. It is starting in a number of African countries. Big innovations in fintech, big innovations in e-commerce. And what's interesting about this is, well, there's several things that are interesting about it. One is a lot of the business models associated with the successful high-growth companies, funded initially by venture capitalists and then the growth equity folks that I am partly associated with, is that you make money the more inclusive the growth patterns are, right? So basically, a lot of these companies make money by accessing populations that were underserved through the traditional channels before. I mean, take fintech. You know, once you have a mobile payment system and a mobile internet widely dispersed, you start to collect data. And the folks in China and a lot of other places have discovered you can take that data and do credit scoring and essentially digitally underpin microfinance and make it sustainable. Big deal, and then people start having access to credit and starting companies and so on. It's an important trend and very positive. This is TSMC. You all know this, but the thing in your pocket is a 5 nanometer semiconductor chip. They're at 3 nanometers now, and the most recent thing I've heard is they're going to be able to produce 2 nanometer chips. Just so you know what that means. I mean, you have a sense of what the power of that thing is. You can't do AI without the training of AI without these chips. But at 2 nanometers, if they get there, that's approximately 500 million transistors per square millimeter on the chip, something like that. So this is my kind of, sense of the digital transformation. It's not all AI related, but it's pretty impressive. The one I think that has attracted my attention, and I recommend it as a case study, is India. India has a biometric digital identity system that works very well. The government uses it to make direct transfers to individuals who are clearly identified and formerly didn't have an identity. No birth certificate, no passport or anything, bypassing all the bureaucratic, fraud, removal of funds on the way through and so on. They have a universal payments interface, and they have the Geo Revolution, which added 400 million mobile internet users in India at the lowest data rates, probably in the world. And so what you'd see is just an explosion of activity in this area. I'm going to have to stop. I'll leave this with you. I asked ChatGPT to tell me how Singapore's economy would evolve. It's pretty impressive. I asked it twice, and it gave me different answers. But that's part of the characteristic. There's a random element in this. Generative AI. It's way too early, to sound like you know what you're talking about in this. But I think there's a reasonable guess that if we can avoid holding it up because of the extreme, potential for misuse in a wide range of areas, and we have to do that, and the regulators don't know how to do it now, so they're going to have to catch up. But if we do, this, I think, has the potential, along with some of these other digital technologies, and this is what I wanted to say to you, to produce an enormous productivity surge in pretty much across the global economy. And if that's true, then that somewhat bleak picture in terms of growth that I painted before, I think looks very, very different. But on generative AI in particular, here's what I think has caused first of all, you all know the adoption, the users went from 0 to 100 million in a month, I think it was. That's just never happened before. So it's accessible. The second thing is that if you spend a lot of time in AI, you know that for a long time, even with the big breakthroughs we've had, the sense of where AI worked was in well-defined domains, or if you shift the robotics, it means structured environments, but the idea is the same. Structured environment means there aren't a lot of parameters that you have to master to understand the environment you're in. So restricted domain means, you're dealing with spreadsheets, right? Or you're dealing with proteins or something like that, right? Or a game. You're not dealing with whatever's on the internet. And people thought you couldn't do that. And so what has shocked people about generative AI in this kind of expansive form is that apparently it can orient itself. So if you ask it about Christopher Columbus, it knows what you're talking about. It doesn't start talking about math, right? And so on. This wasn't thought possible, or at least it looked a long way off. And that's why some people think this is at least one step toward artificial general intelligence, because we didn't think the systems could do this. So there's, we're on a kind of journey of exploration. I think the way this is going to develop in terms of the economy is there'll be literally hundreds and hundreds and thousands of applications going back to limited domains. And what will happen there is companies will take proprietary data. Because it's a limited domain, the computing requirements are less onerous than they are with these big models. The computing requirement you need for ChatGPT or Bard is just astonishing. Basically you can't do it unless you have Google's cloud or Amazon Web Services or Alibaba's system or something like that. You literally can count them on the fingers of two hands. The academic community does not have access to this. I think it's a big deal in terms of research that we need to find a way to get the academic community to have, one way or another, to have access to enough computing power to further the research side of this. Eric Brynjolfsson and colleagues just produced a paper some of you have seen. It's basically a case study. And what happened is they took a company that is using artificial intelligence operating on recordings of customer service and customer interactions in a tech sector. The customer service people are helping them with networks, computers, that stuff. So they have recordings of all customer service interactions and performance characteristics. Did they solve the problem? How long did it take? Were they rude? Did both of them or one of them get mad? Just an enormous amount of data. And they trained it. And then they use it to help the customer service people do a better job. And the two conclusions that come out of that is there's a big productivity increase, very specific, well measured. But the most interesting conclusion is if you array the customer service agents in terms of experience and presumably effectiveness from the highest down here to the lowest where there's a lot of turnover because not everybody succeeds, and ask where did the big productivity boost come from? It came here, right? These people weren't helped that much because they already knew it. But these people, right, their productivity just shot up and became much more effective, much faster. The way Eric and his colleagues describe it is it's essentially a high-speed journey down the learning curve. You know what it reminded me of? And I'm going to stop. It reminded me of London taxis before and after Google Maps, right? Think about it. It used to take 5 years to learn London well enough to get around Google Maps, and all of a sudden the newcomers they're maybe not as good as the old timers, but the differential, the divergence, goes away. I think you can see by this that there's a huge amount of potential. So I'll finish with two stories, just to scare you a bit. So I was talking to a friend at Google, reports to the CEO, went there from McKinsey, about Bard, which is the alphabet version of this. And he told me two stories I thought were interesting. One of them is, he said, they asked it a question about inflation. Tell us, something about inflation. Wrote a very interesting 2-page essay on inflation. And at the end of the essay, it said, if you want to go into this subject further, you might want to read the following 5 things, or 1 or 2 of them. And it listed 3 papers and 2 books with plausible sounding titles. None of them exist. I just made it up. So this is called hallucinations, and I mention it because it's important. There's 2 dimensions to this, right? One is in the world of, sort of facts and getting things right and making the right decisions. Another part of it is expanding your mind, making you think about things you never thought about before. And hallucinations are not that different from what AlphaZero did. It essentially plays against itself. And what happened is they discovered strategies that no humans had ever discovered in playing in the game of Go, right? And so now the humans are watching the machines play and getting new ideas. And there's a lot of evidence that this matters. They've interviewed people in the creative arts, various kinds, and thinking they'll be terrified, this machine's going to replace me, and they're by and large thinking, gee, I got a new idea from that. There's a creative, I don't know what, innovative side to this that's important. Last story, and I apologize to you for being overly long, is somebody just as a joke gave Bard a few prompts in Bengali, the language of Bangladesh, thinking, well, it can't process that. We have no idea whether it's been training itself on Bengali, even though it had access to the whole internet. They thought nothing will happen with that. And they went away and came back, and Bard had mastered Bengali. And they don't know how or why. So even one of the reasons that some of these folks who are in the business of building these machines are being a little cautious about it is they don't fully understand, you know, what they're actually doing in there and what they're capable of. So it's a pretty interesting time. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Spence, for the insightful remarks. I would now like to invite Professor Steve Davis to join Professor Michael Spence on stage for the discussion, please.
That was great, Mike. Let me first say I was not previously aware of the key role played by the MSA staff paper in the Growth Commission, so hats off to the MAS. And I noticed, my eyesight was good enough to see that Edward Robinson was one of the co-authors. So great job, Edward. Keep up the good work. Second, just a footnote on your remarks about inequality. I took a look at the paper by Thomas Piketty and others that you referenced there. Yep. And there's a chart in there that takes their measure of inequality and does it globally, with and without adjusting for taxes. And so going back to 1900, and I just want to put this on the table, the level of inequality as they measure it globally is about the same as it was in 1900 on a pre-tax basis. And on an after-tax basis, it's notably lower now than it was in 1900, and most of that decline has arisen since 2000. So the reason I bring this up is because I often hear pundits and economists, I think, cast an overly pessimistic assessment on our performance as a society globally with respect to inequality. So I just want to note that since 1900, there have been spectacular increases in living standards and lifespans, with essentially little change in overall inequality or a modest fall, depending on how you measure it. It doesn't mean the work is done there. I just think it's appropriate to recognize the success. And then let me now come to a question that's prompted by the supply constraints part of your remarks. And there are many things to talk about there and in the last of your remarks, but I'm struck by the potential to invest in global public goods that have really high payoffs, that require some coordination among at least the G7 and other rich countries. So let me give some examples.
Good.
You showed us the chart, which also Maury showed us a version of earlier, right, about what happened to international shipping costs, right, in the wake of the pandemic, and they shot up tremendously. And you know, the clear implication of that is that the global the ocean shipping system was running at near capacity, and so once there was something that disrupted, that left ships stranded offshore and so on, prices shot up tremendously. So it seems like there's a clear opportunity globally to invest in some excess capacity, yep, in the global shipping system, so that the next time there's some type of disruptive event, it could be a pandemic, it could be a geopolitical flashpoint, we don't have that same kind of problem again, which, as you pointed out, contributed to the initial upsurge in inflation, or maybe that came in the earlier discussion. So one example, you know, should the G7 and other wealthy countries get together and subsidize a little bit more capacity in global shipping. Second example, not something you mentioned, but seemed quite evident in our experience in the pandemic itself, that it would have been great if we'd had a little bit more vaccine production capacity distributed around the world And that's something we could also invest in so that instead of taking months, in some cases more than a year, to get vaccines, newly developed vaccines, to people who needed them, it could be done in a period of weeks or months. That seems like another example of low-hanging fruit, where there's a clear role, seems to me a win-win role, with fairly modest investments by global standards that could make the next pandemic, if there is one, much less painful. And I understand from the little reading I've done in the epidemiology literature that there are good reasons to expect that the rate of new pandemics going forward is likely to be greater than what we've experienced in the century since the Spanish flu. And then you yourself gave this great example of the 200 million protein amino acid sequences that have now been turned into these predictions of what the shapes are. And that's just a tremendous global public good. Sure. For research in bioengineering. And some of the other AI examples that you talked about could lend themselves to that too. So I'm basically this is a bit of a positive take on what you said, but I wanted to get your reaction to, should we be making more efforts to invest in the kinds of global public goods that I've just described? And what more than the examples that I gave can we do? Can we, the WTO, the GATT, that seems to be like we're at a dead end, but are there other things that we can do to foster a spirit of global cooperation with big economic payoffs?
I'll give a long-winded answer, yes. No, I mean, you're right on target here. I mean, let's take the global supply chain. So that was a tightly wound system because of it's constructed by people trying to be efficient. We can unwind it fairly a little bit by putting, collectively public resources into it. But there is another feature, which is because it's constructed in a highly decentralized fashion, as are many networks, there is no database that allows you to see into the state of the system, right? And that means that if you're a player in the system, you have no way of really being able to anticipate that it's going to fail in certain respects and adapt your behavior. The way you found out that there was a problem there is when you try to order for Christmas, in September and discovered that you should have done it in May, all right? I mean, that story it's in the newspapers over and over again. So there's two things you can do to fix that, and this is just an example, and it's repeated many, many times, is one, invest in a little bit of a buffering capacity, but the other one is, don't leave people with the bullwhip effect, out on the end of the system, and invest in cooperative behavior with responsible data and secure management that's then a public good that allows people to understand a very complex system that occasionally can trip them up. So, I mean, that would be an example. And I just think there are many. I mean, I followed the vaccine rollout fairly carefully because it is a development issue. And it was sort of screwed up by institutional problems of, it wasn't, so in the developed countries weren't forceful enough with the drug companies, the people who developed the vaccines. They should have said, look, we invested heavily alongside of you. Michael Kramer's documented why that was a pretty successful operation, and he's right. Up to that point, we could have said, okay, we co-invested with you. The rules are, you got to sell them to these other people, and if you won't sell them at a discount, then maybe we'll have a negotiation about that. But if we'll find something in the middle, and then we, the developed countries, the multinationals, will pay for it, ship them to the international organizations that were supposed to do the distribution. It just got screwed up at multiple levels, and so I think one of the messages that you're getting at, Steve, is one of the public goods we need are flexible, very effective, organizations that can move quickly and remove these kind of obstacles. If we I was going to say, when you said if we have another pandemic, you meant when, right? We don't want to, you can't solve these things under pressure if you keep reinventing the wheel. So there's something about institutional capacity that's flexible and deployable that I think fits into your category.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I agree with that. I do actually think that the institutional problems of cooperation are mitigated if you've just got more excess production capacity in advance of vaccines. So even within Europe, there were conflicts among European nations about sharing the vaccines that were available, and the European Union is one of them.
Let me give you an example. So the question was, production capacity. So the South Africans and a bunch of people wanted to produce it. It turns out there's a fair amount of intellectual property in the production process as well as in the development of the vaccine. And the major players did not want to transfer the production capacity IP, willy-nilly into India and South Africa and so on. It was stuff like that we tripped up on. Again, I agree with you. If we anticipate that kind of stuff in advance, then we'll do a better job at high speed when we get there. And you're right about, if you have excess capacity, it'll help in a lot of areas.
So I'm going to turn to a question. Let me try to give my summary of what I'm trying to say and what I think Mike is saying as well in this domain is, if you think about what happened after World War II, there were very high tariffs throughout much of the world. And we created the GATT, we created the WTO. These were institutions that for decades worked quite well in not getting to a perfect world by any means, but getting to a much better world. That seems to have played out partly because we've, out of success, tariffs are much lower than they were before then, and partly because of rising geopolitical tensions. But I would like to see some other arena in which global cooperation, generating public goods that are widely spread, becomes the focus of policymaking internationally, not only for its direct benefits, direct economic benefits, but also to just encourage a more, how should I say, cooperative equilibrium outcome rather than a non-cooperative one, which we seem to be gravitating towards. So let me open up the floor.
Could I comment
yeah,
on that?
Mike, please
Just
do.
one sentence. So the hope was that G20 would do that. But there's a problem. One is the G20 is very heterogeneous, and now it's caught up in the American-China geopolitical tensions. But it's worse than that. It's badly designed. It worked great at the height of the pandemic because everybody has a different agenda. But basically what happens to the G20 is it doesn't have a powerful secretariat. It has no real continuity, and the thing gets passed every year around the world. So country X has this agenda, and, I don't mean it's quite as incoherent as I'm making it sound, but it doesn't work very well. And so if that doesn't work very well, then we're going to have to be creative and find something else, because the benefits are great. Right. And one comment on inequality. I think what you said is right. What I found interesting about that graph is because it tracks the inter-country versus within-country patterns of inequality. And so you can see clearly what I think most people know, which you can see the Gilded Age version, the post-war decline in inequality that lasted about 30 years, and then the rise again, and the within country. And then you can see the developing country growth and the decline of it's interesting. It's not visible for the first about 25 years after the war. Partly, I suspect, because there's weighted averages, and the developing world didn't have a big enough weight to show up in the data until you got the big growth stories coming in. And the last thing I'll say about inequality, we spent a lot of time on inequality. I think you would agree, Senior Minister. So there's income inequality, wealth inequality. There's that both as incomes and inputs, right? I mean, there's a pretty effective case to be made that if the going-in condition is high wealth inequality, there'll be obstacles to, based on vested interests, to, full-bore growth strategies. But I'll use the American term, but the one thing, dimension, which is neither in, ex post or ex ante, or is ex ante actually, is what Americans call equality of opportunity. So what the experts told us is that if you want something that's really toxic, it's some major failure or exclusion of, a group with a big enough group with respect to opportunity. Everybody knows people have different capacities and markets don't produce equal outcomes, and that wasn't a problem. But major failures of equality of opportunity, meaning modulo your preferences and capacities, do you have a shot? Those just tear societies apart. And there's relatively few examples, if any, of countries that have grown at a high rate that had that kind of a problem associated with it.
Okay, let me open it up. Who wants to offer a comment or a question? Yes, Amr. Let's get a microphone up here in the front. Thank you.
It's kind of a technical question, so you can feel free to pass, but I was just wondering, you had on one of the slides that something may not show up in productivity growth.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to know your high-level thoughts of the way we measure productivity growth relative to what you actually think is going on in the real world.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question. What I mean is, I did not mean to be critical of the way we measure productivity growth, nor to suggest that we should stop measuring it. It's just an incomplete, if you think we need a vector to have a reasonably comprehensive assessment of economic and social performance, there's almost, I think, universal agreement that you can't do that with just the national income account. So I was probably thinking health or educational outcomes or something like that that may have a marginal effect on economic data, but are materially important. We were asked the question, why are you so focused on growth in the Growth Commission? And there were two answers to that. The World Bank thought in the 1990s that the growth agenda was slipping away, and being replaced by all kinds of other stuff. And what they knew, and what I think is still true, is that growth isn't what people care about. They care about, the opportunities for their children and grandchildren and, material prosperity, but health and education and opportunity to be productive and creative. You know what I'm talking about. But a lot of those things are difficult to deliver sustainably without plain old ordinary garden variety growth. So that's why and growth is hard. I learned this from the commissioners. So that's why we focused on growth. It's not because we thought that was the item one in the objective function, right? But now what I think we're seeing is a set of potential opportunities that land in different parts of whatever you think this vector is. It's interesting. I mean, even in the developing world, there have been major strides forward in health, and they don't always match on a country-by-country basis the performance in terms of economics. So you can find countries that have struggled with growth where the health outcomes are really fairly impressive relative to the economic performance. But that's what I had in mind. Oh, does that help? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to endorse that view that growth opens up space for people to pursue upward mobility. And I share your earlier expressed view. That's really central for social cohesion and harmony. So I'm very much in the pro-growth camp. It sounds like, so what's the Growth Commission on that? Yes, Shebnan.
You can have mine.
Hi, I want to go back to Steve's question on the global vaccinations, because this is going to be related to what you predict for the future. You finish as saying it is going to be interesting times because we have these amazing advancements in biomedical and generative IT and all that, and this is going to bring us these huge productivity growth and benefits. But I think global governance has to be part of that story at a very high level. Going back to the vaccination example, we wrote this paper titled Economic Case for Global Vaccinations. I presented this in WHO press conference as the only economist with Dr. Tedros in January 2021. I gave a congressional testimony on this. I mean, the paper predicted the shipping cost increase, persistent supply chain disruptions. I mean, when you look at the data, Global Production and Trade Network, it was very clear to us as of January 2021, this is going to work out exactly like this when, certain parts of the world closing production, like China. And there were initiatives. COVAX was a very good initiative to collect the data and to distribute globally. And in spite of the copyright issues you were talking about, there were other plans to do that without transferring the copyrights to, South Africa, India, big production. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. It's just a huge failure of global governance that we couldn't send vaccines to these parts of the world when US, Europe, everybody's overbuying and, overstocking. So it's just a huge failure of global government on such a, simple issue and public good. Our paper estimates a return to investment of, distributing vaccines globally of 125 times. And this didn't happen. So why do you think this amazing, technologies, which is going to have way more issues with property rights and profits, is going to be giving us this huge growth and productivity in this world?
Very, very interesting question. So, first of all, your description, up close of the vaccine thing is absolutely accurate and distressing. I'm going to answer the second part, because some of these benefits don't require, they just require entrepreneurial activity and whatnot, and then competition and the usual stuff we're used to. So I'm pretty optimistic on dimensions of that where we don't need, this kind of global coordination problem. The way I think about this is there are times, whether it's a company or a country, where the system locks up. There's this group and that group, and they don't have well-defined things. And one of the roles of leadership is to break the logjam, or just say, okay, stop it, right? Enough. The same is true in companies. Well-run companies, the senior leadership sort of lets people express their opinion, they collect all this stuff, but they don't let them talk indefinitely, and there's no lack of clarity about who's going to make the decision, and then somebody makes the decision. So at both the national level when it works and at the other institution level, I think, and the thing that's missing in the global economy is anybody who is the delegated authority to say enough or stop it, right? Or, okay, I've heard everything I need to hear, now we're going to do the following things. And so we end up in the endless negotiation cycle with, even when there's catastrophic consequences. The most interesting thing about the vaccine thing was I think you just said it, but I'll say it a slightly different way. You didn't have to argue this on the basis of, looking after other people. I mean, the direct feedback effect of not vaccinating a large group of people who are going to generate the next 4 variants was sort of obvious, right? And in a connected global economy, it wasn't going to take long to come back. So I think that's what we're missing. I mean, it's in the sense, Steve just said it too, who's going to step, are we going to be able to get to a point where, at least for a defined set of things that I think are associated with the need for rapid action or a response to a crisis or something, the only counterexample I can think of was the one time the G20 worked, and it happened to be in London under Gordon Brown. And they basically, everybody got together, the finance ministers, the leaders, the central bankers, and they did a fantastic job of dealing with that. And so it's not impossible, but that was a pretty dire crisis, right?
Yes, I was going to add to that, but since we've got a question, can we get a mic up here? Thanks.
Just a comment. You show this productivity in tradable, non-tradables chart. You mentioned something about white collars. All these technologies, if you had to guess, how would they map into employment, productivity in the two sectors, a reallocation of production? What can we expect there? Also, of course, relative prices.
It'll map into the, so the technologists divide the world at, this is crude, into bits and atoms, okay? Or us ordinary people say it's the knowledge economy and then remind ourselves that's pretty broad. And then there's the physical world, where we make things and serve things in restaurants and stuff like that. So I think Sundar Pichai, CEO of Alphabet, is right. The immediate proximate impact is going to land on the knowledge world. How many of us work there? In an advanced economy, it's over 50% now. And, it'll be disruptive, and maybe we'll have a transitory unemployment problem, or maybe we'll work less if we're that productive, or people are going to have to learn new skills. None of this is unfamiliar. It's just a kind of turbocharged version of it. And it doesn't map on, it partially maps onto tradable and non-tradable, but most of the thing that makes this is hard to describe, but I'll give it a try. The tradable part has a knowledge part where the impact's going to be big. I mean, it has a service part. Part of it's global, da-da-da. Then it has the manufacturing sector. Now, the manufacturing sector has stabilized in terms of employment in the last decade in the American economy. And when you come to digital technology, then you have to get into the atoms world and robotics, as well as just the bits world. But it's a structured environment, okay? So remember I said well-defined domain, structured environment. So the progress of robotics is bigger in those structured environments. It's not that impressive, but it's fairly impressive. So you'll see if this ChatGPT-like things will start to power robotics. You can actually tell them to do something, and they won't get lost. They don't have to find the bathroom. They won't trip on something. I mean, they can see more or less. A lot of the unstructured environments, and then you go into the non-tradable sector. There's still management, right? There's still information systems. Maybe nurses will have assistants, powerful assistants like those customer service people. So I don't mean to say it won't land there, but then there's things like, there's 10 million people in the American economy that work in restaurants, right? Low productivity, low wages in incomes, probably not much impact until we get another breakthrough in technology. The last thing I'll say is, so it's like a matrix, but the bigger impact is going to be in the tradable sector, which is already the more productive. It'll certainly be in the higher income part of the spectrum, because that's the way the income distribution looks. The only other thing I'll say is I don't know how fast this is going to happen, but the AI people are working on expanding the digital footprint into the atoms world. So you can see part of this in autonomous vehicles, right? So autonomous vehicles fit this description right now pretty well. They work well in the parking lot, pretty well on well-marked freeways. I mean, there's problems. Somebody was telling me the other day, Danny, maybe it was you, if there's a paper bag on the road, humans don't have any trouble telling it's a paper bag, but the car does. The sensors pick it up and they think, geez, I might run into that, and it might stop. They do terribly in shadows, right? They don't, it's a disaster in snowstorms. They just don't know how to adapt it. This isn't a permanent blockage, but it's there. And so I think for the foreseeable future, we'll operate with, augmented driving capabilities, but not autonomous this and that. But anyway, I think that's kind of where we're going. On the productivity front, they're pessimists about the magnitude of the challenges in the area of robotics, but they're really big. I mean, this is where I apologize, I'll stop here, but this is why I've been spending time with robotics people, because I didn't understand this before, robotics and AI people. When you look at something, anybody in this room, you have a two-dimensional image on your retina. So do the sensors in the robot. But you don't see a two-dimensional thing. You see a three-dimensional thing and have an enormous amount of situational awareness. You know what this room looks like, where the people are, where the doors are. You can probably guess where the loo is, right? The robots have none of that. They have to be taught, right? And so something like, a supercharged version of generative AI is what they need to acquire. And the great irony of this, in the bits world, in many dimensions, the AI systems are superhuman. In the atoms world, they're not even remotely close to doing what not only you do, and they'll never be superhuman, or not for a long, long time, but they can't even do what a child at the age of 8 can do. And so what you realize, if you're interested in the science of this, is that very early on, we acquire, this is, I think, what the people who, study sort of neural systems are interested in. We acquire a set of unbelievably sophisticated capabilities that we're not even aware of, that we, and you only see what those are when you try to reproduce them.
Well, thank you, Mike. Well, my situational awareness tells me we're out of time. So have to take up this last one at the break. We're actually over time. So Mike, I want to thank you for an extremely stimulating conversation. I enjoyed it immensely. I'm sure the audience did as well. And just thanks so much for joining us here and sharing some of your insights. We really appreciate it.